This is the spindle nut socket that I went through a lot of trouble to locate. It's not an exact match. It's got 4 pins. The spindle has 8 on this tracker, but it is the only one out of every single spindle socket that I found and bought and brought home and compared. Out of every single store, a hardware store and an automotive store that I have locally here, and even searching online, that even remotely matched the pins. I believe it was for Ford, I can't remember exactly, and I think I got it at an O'Reilly's. I'm pretty sure it was O'Reilly's. The part number on here is W as in whiskey 83010. And this is the one socket that actually aligns with the pins on the spindle nut. They're a little bit rounded. The spindle nut's not, they should be flusher to make better contact, but I also, after buying a lot of loaner tools, found the combination that works to seat this properly and keep it fitted so that I can tighten the spindle down to specs. And I'll show you that in a bit. As you can see, there's 8 on the spindle nut, 4 on this socket, but it seats. See, it's not exactly the right one, but it does do the job, and it does line up properly. In order to stabilize the socket, I use this wheel puller, Harbor Freight, I forget exactly, $20, $22, something like that, and multi-purpose. After I'd gone through every single rental tool, every single puller, everything I could think of to help hold this socket on, and cleaning those bar clamps, this is actually perfect. It's completely solid. So you loosen it and you tighten it with this. And to make a store run, the half-inch drive, the only one that I had, started to actually turn. And that's obviously not going to work. So I got a shorter 3-inch, half-inch extension, and that should take care of it. Now I gotta back off the puller so I can finish pulling this thing out. Remove the inner seal, the snap ring, replace the bearing. Now I have the hub out, the bearings, the lock rings, snap ring. This is all the outer, the wheel bearing, the 2 washers, the lock nut, and this is the inner bearing, snap ring, and the seal. It's nice and clean, ready to grease. I got this high temp grease. It's specifically made for wheel bearings and other applications, but wheel bearings as well. And just lubricate the entire thing inside, insert the bearings, put everything back in order, and put it back together. The inner one is packed decently well. Putting the snap ring back, make sure it's seated properly. A little excess grease squeezed out, but that's okay. And I'm just going to very carefully use this to set it in there. I'm going to tap this in, make sure it goes in flat and even. Line some grease before I put the outer wheel bearing in. Make sure that there is plenty of grease around the wheel bearing. And I think we're ready to reassemble. And I checked the old bearing, the inner bearing. There was a little bit of roughness to it. Not too bad, but that definitely can cause the wobble that I was having. And I put a small layer, maybe a little too much, on the back, on the inside of the hub, and I'm placing it back in place. A little force, get it past the seal, and now it's in place. I'm gonna next put a little more grease on the outer wheel bearing, insert, and then add the washers and the lock nut. Make sure you get the order correct. this flat washer. It's keyed, so you can only put it in one spot. Also, don't forget to grease the spindle as well before you put the bearings on. First washer's in place, minding the keyhole. Same with this other interesting washer. And then the nut, which I would suggest cleaning off as much grease as possible so that the socket sits on it. Although since we have the pullers holding it in place, it should be fine, but I'd still do it so it does less chance of slippage. Oh yeah, and I'm gonna wipe off the threads. Now I've put everything back in place to tighten it down. I tighten it down by hand first, of course. Put the puller on top, the 1/2-inch drive extension, and my torque wrench is set to 159 foot-pounds, which is to specs. For the front wheel bearing lock nut, it's also sometimes called a spindle nut, and I'm going to torque it down and put everything back together. It is nice and tight. Verified the hub doesn't seem to have any wiggle at this time. And as a precautionary measure, I would not torque this down, or I would not tighten this down all the way. I would leave it just a hair loose where it still has some play. Because if you put pressure against it, you might not get a true torque when you tighten it down. It might affect how much its pressure is being applied. Okay, well, that's 159. There's no play. Earlier, before I started all this, there was a little bit. And it looks like it's gonna be good. Put the cap back on. Try to put it on even, and I failed to do that. Make sure you put it all the way down. And now for the rotor. I'm going to change out gloves so I don't get grease on that. Brake rotor's in place. Caliper and mounting bracket. Make sure the brake pads are on either side so you can put it back over the rotor. Okay, that's torqued down, the caliper, mounting bracket. And when I put the tire back on, usually what I do is I line up the lug bolts in the holes and then slide it up so it goes right in place. And then start with the bottom one so you don't have to keep holding the tire here. Now to lower the vehicle and test drive. And it's not even jiggling at all. It's great. The tire had a little bit of a wobble before. Put the whole camera in when I moved the car.